Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger Willliams, and I welcome you to historyauthortalks.com. I am very pleased that we have yet another wonderful show this evening. I wanted to let you all know that we have started History Author Talks for the express reason of bringing history authors closer to their readers. I'm very pleased that we've had some wonderful shows, and you are able to go back and look at our previous shows, as you will with this show, at historyauthortalks.com. You will be able to go to the past shows tab, and you can see any of our prior shows. Now, for History Author Talks tonight, I am very pleased that we have some terrific authors who are joining us from Virginia and Massachusetts. And I will, during the show, I will be putting in the chat feature, I will be putting some websites that will include the websites of our author guests. I will also be giving you the link to bookshop.org, which includes a place to purchase the books from our guests and our illustrious guest host. And during our show, if you have questions for our guests, you can use the chat feature. That chat feature will send your question to me, and I will send your questions to the guest host, so that after each of our guests have an opportunity to present their talk, we will have a question and answer period that will be conducted by our guest host with our authors. So for tonight, I am very pleased to introduce as our guest host, Lindsay Chervinsky, scholar in residence at the Institute for the Thomas Paine Studies and the Senior Fellow of the International Center for Jefferson Studies. She is also the author of The Cabinet, George Washington, and the creation of an American Institution. Lindsay was actually my first guest on History Author Talks, and I am very pleased right now to begin our show, The Conundrum of the Presidency, how it started and what it has become, with our guest host, Lindsay Chervinsky. Lindsay, over to you.
Thanks so much, Roger, and thank you everyone for being here. It's my pleasure to guest host this evening. As Roger said, I had the privilege of being a guest as well. I know the importance of good questions, so I will try and live up to that lofty goal. It's especially fun for me to be able to guest host this particular event because the subject is very near and dear to my heart. In fact, I'm quite certain that if there wasn't a time limit, the three of us could probably talk on and on and on and on for hours, but I promise we won't do that because that would be annoying for everyone else involved, I'm sure. So to get things started, we have two great scholars this evening. I'm going to introduce them, I think, one at a time so that your thoughts about their work are sort of fresh in your mind when they come on to share a few words with you. Each of them will speak for a few minutes, and then I will ask them questions, but then I'm also eager to get to your questions because as a speaker, I'm always most interested in what you want to know, and I want to be able to talk about those things. And so I'm sure we will be able to have lots of good conversations. So we are starting with Tony Willliams, who is a senior teaching fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute. He is the author of several books, including work on including the Hurricane of Independence, the Pax and the Covenant, the Jamestown Experiment, America's Beginnings. So clearly he has a little bit of a theme, which is excellent for tonight. His most recent book is Washington and Hamilton, which was, as it happens, co-authored with our other guest, and is now working on a book on the Declaration of Independence. So Tony, feel free to take it away.
Thank you very much, Lindsay and Roger, for hosting this event, putting it together. Really appreciate it. Well, I've been invited to speak a little bit about Washington and Hamilton, and I'm happy to do so. I was especially happy to work with Steve on this book, which was published a few years ago. And to provide that overview, I think we should start a little bit with their childhoods and something that we paid a lot of attention to in this book, their respective characters and what that brought to the to that collaboration, to that relationship. We describe Washington as really the quintessential man of virtue in that 18th century sense, that Republican virtue. Played the role of the Roman statesman, the man who was patriotic, who lived a life of public service, who selflessly and disinterestedly served the republic, and Washington really embodies that Roman statesman. Hamilton was the man of honor, honor being the measure of a man, courageous in battle, trustworthy. Had his credit and his public reputation was sort of stainless, and Hamilton obviously very quick to defend that honor, as we'll see. Now, Washington, very briefly, obviously lived a life of some privilege as a Virginia planter, but also made his way in the world, right, with the help of some patrons. Was ambitious for fame, particularly glory in war, but also in public service and as a statesman, as a lawgiver, if you will. Hamilton had very obscure and quite difficult, one might even say a bleak, and at times very dysfunctional childhood, was orphaned as a teenager, and after really living sort of on the margins of West Indian or Caribbean society, and was also helped very much so by patrons who helped him rise. He was very ambitious for fame, for glory in war, and fortunately came to America to study at Princeton University, what was then the College of New Jersey. Didn't end up there, but ended up at King's College in New York instead, and quickly joined the Patriot movement. So we have these two founders who came from very different backgrounds and really joined the Patriot movement at different times, but no less fervently than each other. Both were involved in that resistance movement. Hamilton starting in 1775, Washington all the way back, with the Stamp Act, and both really embraced that natural rights republic, the idea of free government, of Republican self-government. Just a quick nugget from both. Washington had served in the Virginia House of Burgesses, later on in the Continental Congress, and articulated the idea, I think, these Republican ideas very well, and mostly in his private papers, some public pronouncements, right, the Declaration or important pamphlets, that kind of thing, but still articulated these ideas well, particularly in private letters. And he said, "Parliament hath no more right to tax us without our consent than I have to put my hand into your pocket and to take your money without your consent." And he also said, it is not a matter of 3 cents per pound for tea. He said it is a matter of constitutional right. Okay. Hamilton has an incredible genius. At 17 years old, wrote a pamphlet called Farmer Refuted. And he wrote very eloquently, in words sort of rivaling the Declaration. He said, "The rights of mankind are not to be rummaged for in old and musty parchments. Instead, they are written as by the hand of divinity upon the entire volume of human nature itself, and cannot be erased or obscured by any mortal power," right? So he writes very beautifully about these sort of Lockean ideas of natural rights and consent. Well, they came together during the war, right? Of course, Washington is the commander-in-chief of the army in this exalted position. Hamilton joins in during the Battle of New York. His courage during that sort of ignominious retreat across New York and New Jersey comes to Washington's attention, and he's very quickly offered a position on Washington's staff, and very quickly becomes his right-hand man, really his, in many ways, most trusted staff advisor, staff officer. And the book obviously goes into a lot more detail about all the battles that they're in, and important decisions that they make, and how close this relationship becomes during the war. But I'd like to just point out a few things. One is, they made a lot of important strategic decisions together at the heart of this officer corps, really at the highest levels. Two, they really helped establish the basis for a Republican ideal of civil-military relations. They firmly wanted to put the military subordinate to the Republican government, and Washington will really honor this. They know their history. They know the way that republics usually went throughout history. They usually didn't end up well, and so Washington and Hamilton are very deferential in many ways to the civilian government, even when that government is detrimental to the war effort, which is very interesting. Advancement in the Army will also come through merit, through virtue, through talent, rather than these ties of blood, as in aristocratic systems such as the British. And then finally, I'd really like to point out that the officer corps around Washington and Hamilton and these other important subordinates like Nathaniel Greene and Henry Knox, John Lawrence, really they become the center of this continental vision, right? The idea that, national union of the American continent, of American nationhood, they really become the vanguard of that movement during the war. And then after, and obviously that'll become really important. And Steve and I really teased this out in Washington and Hamilton. The third era I'd really like to talk about is this constitutional era, or this nationalistic era, of nation building. The war ends, the Articles of Confederation become the government. It provides a pretty weak national government. It's really, in many ways, pretty ineffectual. And you have Washington and Hamilton, as I said, at the leadership of this continental vision of national union. They work very diligently for that stronger national government. Washington is officially retired, but he's sort of dragged out of retirement by events in the 1780s. And, through letters, through and several essays, especially on Hamilton's part, through important events such as the Mount Vernon Conference that Washington hosts. There's a convention at Annapolis in 1786 to resolve a lot of trade disputes and economic problems. And then finally, obviously, most important, at the Constitutional Convention. They are working diligently to promote a stronger national government, but really a stronger republic in general, right? A stronger national union, and they want that national government to be emblematic, to have more energy, to promote a more cohesive, nation in many ways. So it's not just strengthening the government as a means, as an end in itself, but really as a means of achieving real nationhood, which they think is about to, is certainly in crisis mode, and both think that it's probably going to collapse if something's not done. So they go to the Constitutional Convention and they play different roles, but they help get a stronger, more perfect union, a stronger union at that convention. And both are really important in ratification, but in different roles, right? Hamilton is sort of what I call a one-man wrecking crew at the New York Ratifying Convention, and then as an author of a lion's share of the Federalist Papers. Washington really stands aloof from that political debate, but he writes letters in favor of it. He signed the document, which speaks volumes for it. You know, everyone knows that George Washington not only signed the document but supported the document. So he lent his reputation and his you know, his greatness to that document, and it's ratified, right? And so Washington becomes president. He taps Hamilton to join his new cabinet, and this is where I'll finish up, and then we'll turn it over to Steve, who's going to pick it up with the first presidency as well. But they really together shape American institutions, right? It's really what Steve and I argue is the most important relationship of the founding, really, you know, bar none. And in both domestic policy and foreign policy, the two agree about 99% of the time on that policy, and they really shape the political institutions, the economic institutions, the national security institutions, that they breathe life into the new nation through this new government. And you know, we couldn't really imagine any other relationship coming close to creating that new nation. I mean, if we don't have time to go through all of the policies, but you think about foreign policy and the Proclamation of Neutrality, that national strength, the national security system. You know, you look at the Jay Treaty, you look at the response to the Whiskey Rebellion, and you look at the creation of the National Bank and other financial institutions. And really, the country would look very different. Let's say you have Jefferson and Madison in charge, or some other, you know, some other combination. You just don't have the same strength, I think, in terms of nation building and providing that stability going forward as a nation as you do, you know, without Washington and Hamilton, you know, at the helm. So I'll conclude there and turn it back over to Lindsay and Steve, who will probably pick up, I think, where I left off. But just a brief overview of the significance of Washington and Hamilton and how important they were through about 25, 30 years of service.
Thank you so much, and that you guys clearly put some thought into how you would divide this story. So I appreciate it because it's clearly very well organized. So our next guest is Dr. Stephen Knott, who's a professor at the is a professor in the National Security Affairs Department at the War College. He also previously worked with the Oral History Program at the Miller Center, which for those of you who don't know is a truly extraordinary work of public history and sort of an effort to capture political memory in a really unique way. Also a very robust scholar, and in addition to the book that he and Tony are talking about tonight, his most recent work is called The Lost Soul of the American Presidency: The Decline into Demagoguery and the Prospects for Renewal. So not at all relevant. And he is currently at work on a book on the presidency of JFK. So definitely sort of hitting some of the high notes, or not, depending on how you look at it, of the presidency. So Steve, please take it away.
Well, thank you, Lindsay. I'm a big fan of your book
Thank you.
on the cabinet, and congratulate you for a remarkable, I believe, first book. Extremely impressive.
First book, thank you.
You're welcome. So yeah, picking up where Tony left off, and as Lindsay mentioned, my most recent work, The Lost Soul of the American Presidency, sort of traces the path of two conflicting views as to how American presidents should conduct themselves in office. One view that I, for purposes of conciseness, have labeled the constitutionalist view, is associated with people like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison. It views the presidency as a unifying figure, emphasizing more perhaps the head of state role, as opposed to some of the more modern conception of the president as a policymaker and a partisan leader. The other view that I associate more with Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson, and interestingly enough, many 20th century progressives, I've called the populist or popular presidency, which tends to view presidential power as rooted in public consent, shaping public opinion, responding to public opinion. And that vision, I'd say, is the vision that we are sort of living in at the moment. And so, the book has two levels to it. It traces the rise of this populist or popular presidency, and it traces the decline of that constitutionalist head of state role that Washington, Hamilton, and Madison favored. And it does make a pitch at the end for at least a partial restoration for some of that earlier constitutionalist vision of the presidency. And I focus quite a bit on in the book on how various American presidents have resorted to or not resorted to demagoguery. And by demagoguery, of course, we're talking about preying on divisive issues, preying on people's emotions, on their lowest passions in order to inflame them for purposes of consolidating your own power. And I see traces of this, obviously, in Andrew Jackson. I even, and this is where it gets a little controversial, I accuse Thomas Jefferson of sort of at least opening the door to an Andrew Jackson and sort of refounding the American presidency more in this populist conception. And while there were great differences between Jefferson and Jackson, they both had this unbridled confidence in the ability of the American public, of the common man, to make it even simpler, in the right of the majority to govern at all times. And I see certain dangers in that. It seems to me that Washington, Hamilton, some of the other founders, Madison, of course, had a healthy fear of the potential tyranny of the majority. And they tried to create an entire system of which the president was part, which would serve to check that majority tyranny. I think Jefferson begins to chip away at that a bit. And I also see Jackson just kind of knocking the entire edifice down in favor of this principle that the majority is to govern. And as a consequence of that, minorities tended to pay the price. And certainly the Jacksonian era, while it was known as an era of democratic expansion, that was true if one happened to be white and male. It was certainly not true if one happened to be a Native American or a free Black living in parts of the United States, where during the Jacksonian era, while the franchise was being expanded for white males, it was being constricted for free Blacks. So a number of states took steps to disenroll Black voters in places like New York, New Jersey, and elsewhere. So the price of sort of refounding the presidency on a more popular or populist course has been paid throughout American history by minorities. And by minorities, by the way, we could be talking about racial minorities, religious minorities, economic minorities. And if you are out of step with the majority, the notion of a president who is the voice of the people, the tribune of the people, as Jackson liked to refer to it, had a certain downside to it. For the most part, the Washington, Hamilton constitutionalist perspective, I would say, prevails until you get to the presidencies of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. Again, Andrew Jackson being a very glaring exception in the 19th century. Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson sort of take the example of Andrew Jackson. Even though they had differing views about the role of government, they did share Jackson's belief that the president was the tribune of the people, was the defender of their interests against various elites, whether it was the Bank of the United States in the 1830s or Andrew Carnegie in the early 20th century. And so they take elements, Wilson and TR take elements of the Jacksonian presidency and fuse it with a progressive political agenda that leads to the creation of the modern presidency. And I'm going to wrap it up soon here because I'd rather get to your questions than keep talking at you. But I do see something of a straight line from Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson to Donald Trump. And that straight line is this notion that the president should play a role in terms of speaking for his base, that it is appropriate at times for the president to fire up his base. And you see a kind of diminution of the role of the president as a unifying head of state who's responsible for enforcing the rule of law. And so those two conceptions, the constitutionalist presidency, the populist presidency or popular presidency, have been at odds with one another. We've got examples in both camps, although I would say again, for the last 100, 120 years, for the most part, with a couple of exceptions, American presidents have embraced that populist presidency, first somewhat envisioned by Thomas Jefferson, completely envisioned by Andrew Jackson, and embraced wholeheartedly by early 20th century American progressives. So with that, I'll stop there and turn it back to Lindsay.
Excellent. Well, I'll get us started with a few questions while you guys think of what you want to know more about. Please feel free to enter your questions into the chat box, and then I will pass them along to our guests. I encourage you to really put in questions there. I know as someone who has often done these events, we always really appreciate the questions, and there really aren't such things as stupid questions, because if you're wondering, the likelihood that other people are too is much greater than you think. But I'd like to start with, in the book that you two co-wrote, you mentioned that there was this concept of a dignified presidency that Washington and Hamilton really wanted to create. So I'm wondering if you could tell us what sort of were the elements of a dignified presidency, and then who do you think in American history which presidents have best lived up to that concept? For both of you, or either of you, whoever of you feel like handling that one.
Go ahead, Tony.
I was going to say, go ahead, Steve. Well, I think that Washington really embraces, as Steve was talking about, the idea of a constitutional presidency, and he really, as you read through his letters, and, when he's ready to sign these bills, such as the bank bill, he really wants to follow the Constitution. He really takes this duty as president, this fidelity to the Constitution as a sacred obligation, very, very seriously. And, that's why he solicits, so many opinions from his cabinet during the bank bill, and eventually, Hamilton persuades Washington to sign the bill. But I think it's his fidelity to the Constitution, and it's his open-mindedness. He wants to hear from different people. He wants to hear from his opponents, and he wants to do what's right by the Constitution and by the public good. And so, it's very much a constitutional presidency. As for which embody it more recently, I'll defer to Steve if he knows of any. Sure. I think that, basically what we're talking about is, his restraint. Right, he shows constitutional and personal restraint in the office. Personally, I would think, maybe someone like a Coolidge or an Eisenhower, might come the closest in the 20th century to that. Steve might disagree, but presidents in the 20th century have shown less restraint, right, and have assumed greater and greater powers. So that every time there's any kind of crisis, whether it's economic or there's a hurricane or what have you, we immediately look to the president rather than the other branches as well, especially Congress.
So I would add to what Tony had to say by noting that Washington and Hamilton spent a remarkable amount of time in the months leading up to Washington's inauguration and in the months thereafter talking about this question of dignity. How should the president present himself to the American public and to the Congress? And the amount of paperwork that went back and forth between the two of them wrestling with these issues is truly fascinating. And I'd say in the end that they struck a nice balance between being accessible to the public. And in fact, Washington's going to take, I think, what, 3 grand tours of the United States just to, in a sense, show himself to the public and demonstrate to the public that they have nothing to fear from their president or from the office of the presidency. And they also, would have these weekly levees, which were kind of stiff and formal affairs. There's not a lot of kissing of babies and no shaking of hands, no physical contact whatsoever. Everybody's bowing to one another. But the president was at least meeting members of Congress and meeting men, and I assume women, off the street. So they're trying to walk this fine line between respectability and a degree of transparency and accountability. I think they struck a nice balance. And let me just add that Washington saw the president as a unifying figure. And I think he emphasized the sort of head of state role of the president. It put that at the top of the list, and that would be part of one of these elements of dignity. And I think some of that's been lost. And I've never quite entirely understood it, because so much power could accrue to a modern American president if he, eventually she, chose to play that unifying head of state role. But that's been subsumed under this role of partisan cheerleader, sort of stirring the pot, firing up the base. And one of the recommendations I try to make in this book is to at least a partial restoration of a more dignified head of state role for the president.
Excellent. Well, I have some more questions I want to ask, but we have a few that have come in from the audience, so I'm going to prioritize those first. So Tom McAndrew would like to know, he says, Washington despised Monroe. And I'm going to have a little bit of subtext, which is to say that Washington's comments about Monroe's writings are some of the very best things that he penned, if you're looking for entertaining writing. Putting aside that sentiment, how do you think Washington would have felt about Monroe's performance as president had he lived to see it?
I think there's an element of Monroe's presidency that Washington might have admired. And then the fact is that Monroe also took at least one, I may be off on the numbers here, grand tours of the United States, including into the heart of formerly Federalist, rock-ribbed Federalist New England. And he was very warmly received in Boston. He may have even received an honorary degree from Harvard. Perhaps Lindsay knows the answer to that. But Monroe did, I believe, appreciate the head of state role. He did, of course, preside during the so-called era of good feelings. I would say maybe he partly contributed to that by emphasizing that unifying head of state role and not emphasizing what divides Americans. And let me also point out, he put a number of political opponents in his cabinet. And he had something of a diversity of views there. I mean, he's got John Quincy Adams as his Secretary of State. The two did not exactly see eye to eye on every issue, but Monroe understood the need to have a kind of team of rivals, and I think George Washington would have been very appreciative of that.
I would also just add, if I may, that Monroe was an incredibly partisan figure up until around the point that he actually becomes president, and then does take on that sort of nonpartisan approach that you're talking about. So in some ways, it's almost like he tried to emulate Washington's perspective of what it meant to be president, because at least in the 1790s, there is no one who is writing more sort of strident partisan things than Monroe is.
Yeah, and also trying to destroy Alexander Hamilton through the release of the the Maria Reynolds affair and other scandals associated with Hamilton. You're right,
Yeah,
Lindsay, an incredible transition on Monroe's part.
Okay, so Jean O'Connor, who I guess is the author of the upcoming novel, The Remarkable Cause, James Lavelle and the Crucible of the American Revolution, wants to know, how would you compare FDR to Trump in terms of being a populist president?
Yeah, I'm actually very critical of both Donald Trump and to a great extent Franklin Roosevelt in this latest book of mine, because Roosevelt did stir the partisan pot, and in some ways used rhetoric that very few other presidents have used. In his 1944 State of the Union address, Franklin Roosevelt said that if the Republicans were to win the presidency that year, you could expect a return to the kind of fascism that one sees in Europe at the time. That's pretty tough stuff to be labeling, you know, the party of Thomas Dewey and Wendell Willkie as fascists. And Roosevelt also thrived on, and he literally thrived on stirring the pot and accusing the so-called economic royalists in the 1930s of hating him. And he welcomed their hatred. That's the kind of rhetoric you don't see from a Washington or a Lincoln or a John Quincy Adams, for that matter. In answer to the question, I do see some parallels between Trump and an FDR, even though on policy grounds, you know, they're worlds apart on almost everything. And there's a lot I do admire about Franklin Roosevelt in terms of his assembling a first-rate national security team to conduct the Second World War and his ability to lift up the spirits of the American people. There's a lot to praise. But unfortunately, there was a demagogic side to Franklin Roosevelt in dealing both with his Republican opponents and with the Supreme Court, which I find particularly disturbing. And he basically accused the Supreme Court at times of being un-American. That's tough stuff, and as far as I'm concerned, that's the kind of rhetoric presidents should avoid.
Excellent. So James Walsh would like to know what your thoughts are on the John Adams presidency.
Tony?
Well, you know, it's kind of interesting because he faced you know, a divided government as well. I mean, he had Thomas Jefferson, of course, from his rival political party, was his VP, and so there, you know, there was a lot of internal struggle. I do think that at least in terms of national security, you know, he largely achieved, you know, the idea of peace through strength. You know, there were you know, peace was confirmed sort of at that time with the British and the Spanish through a few treaties, but then of course that ignites problems with the French. And so, you know, Adams, like Hamilton and Washington, understand that, you know, we need peace through strength. You know, it makes preparation for war, but also engages in diplomacy at the same time, because he knows that the United States is really not ready to face off against the empires of Europe. And so I think it deserves high praise. Takes it on the chin for sign. He did not, you know, he was not the guiding force behind the Alien and Sedition Acts, but he does sign them and he does enforce them. And, you know, the administration does put political opponents in the press in jail. And, you know, and, you know, they're applied just very politically. It's really kind of bald-faced in that regard. And so I think properly is criticized for some civil liberties violations. But other than that, I think all in all, you know, continues a lot of the nation building of Washington presidency, builds on that, you know, pretty successfully.
I would just add, I have some sympathy for John Adams because in the election of 1800, which arguably was one of the ugliest, if not the ugliest, in American history, Jefferson, or more accurately, Jefferson's lieutenants, portray John Adams as a closet monarchist, or maybe not even so much closet, but monarchist. And of course, the Alien and Sedition Acts plays into that, and that's something that's a permanent scar on Adams's record. But the Jeffersonians were very effective at playing on that anti-British, anti-monarchical sentiment, which almost every American shared, and labeling somebody like Hamilton, as the Jeffersonians did, or Adams as a monarchist was the equivalent of labeling somebody a communist in the 1950s. It was designed to exclude you from the political process, to eliminate you, to destroy you on a personal level, and it worked to great effect. So I have some sympathy for John Adams in that sense.
I also have sympathy for John Adams, but my sympathy comes from the fact that his task was nearly impossible. How do you follow George Washington, who, you know, is widely called the father of his country, and the two are incredibly different in terms of, you know, temperament and presentation, but also anyone was going to fail in comparison. And so I think that we often don't give him credit for the impossibility of what he was being asked to do. So I like to defend John Adams.
Right, and not only is he fighting, you know, a divided government, but even the Federalists, right? You know, he's attacked by Hamilton, he's attacked by other members of the Federalist Party, which starts to become unraveled, right, and during the opposition and into the 1800s. And so, you know, Adams is not only getting it from the opposition, but internally as well.
Good point, Tony.
Yeah, absolutely. So David Price, who is the author of the forthcoming biography of Delaware's John Hazlitt, would like to know, he said, it seems that the presidents who are generally ranked as being great or near great, both Roosevelt's, Lincoln, Truman, Jefferson, would be considered popular rather than constitutional presidents, except Washington and Eisenhower, who are both generals turned political leaders, whether that's coincidental or not. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do agree, David, and that's a terrific point, and it's one that I make in my book. I argue that we need to reconsider, we scholars need to reconsider the standards that we use to label somebody a great president. If I had my way, I would actually sandblast a portion of Mount Rushmore. I shouldn't have gone down this path, but you know, there's a couple folks I'm up there, you know, I'm pretty sure Teddy Roosevelt should not be up there. And if I had my way, I'd replace him with William Howard Taft, who pursued a progressive agenda, but did not, if Taft would fit, that's a big if, but pursued a progressive agenda, but did not engage in the kind of over-the-top rhetoric, disparaging enemies, stirring the pot, trashing other institutions of government, as TR did, particularly later in his Bull Moose incarnation. So scholars have a tendency to favor those presidents who push the boundaries of their office, FDR type presidents, Teddy Roosevelt types, Andrew Jackson as well. I don't. I think we need to reconsider what constitutes presidential greatness. For me, that would be not only an adherence to the Constitution, but more of an adherence to a limited conception of what the presidency should attempt to do. It's not the job of the president to continually stir the pot. It's not even really the job of the president to provide us with a vision and lead us into the promised land. There are two other branches of government. So I would advocate for a conception of greatness that emphasizes limits, that emphasizes the head of state role, that emphasizes the fact that some presidents are able to make a distinction between themselves and the office they temporarily hold. They're passing through, and some of them blur that line. They begin to think of themselves and the office as one. And that's when the problems start. And FDR was one of those people, I think, who began to think of himself as, you know, not drawing a firm boundary between what was good for him and what was good for the office of the presidency. So again, my determination of greatness would be a much more constrained, restricted, presidents who play a more unifying role.
So I'd like to follow up on that with the host privilege, which is, how do you categorize Lincoln? Because he seems to me that he sort of defies that strict bucket system, because he both tries to avoid the politicization of the office that you've talked about in terms of Roosevelt, the Roosevelts, or anything like that. He really tries to sort of be a president for all people as much as one can be in the middle of a civil war. But he expands the power of the presidency enormously. So what bucket do you put him in?
Sure. Yeah, terrific question, Lindsay, and one that I had to wrestle with. I had the toughest time with the Lincoln chapter of that book as opposed to any other chapter, because he does have, in a sense, a foot in both of those camps. He was born in 1809. He sort of cuts his teeth in the Jefferson-Jacksonian era. He comes to really disdain Andrew Jackson, partly for his lawlessness and partly for what I think he sees as a kind of lack of moderation. And of course, Lincoln's Lyceum address, where he talks about the violence against abolitionists, the violence against free blacks, the violence against anyone out of step with the majority, is a sort of classic refutation of Jacksonian America. But nonetheless, this is a man who comes from out of nowhere, literally, who is of, by, and for the people, in a sense. But what sets him apart, I think, from an Andrew Jackson or an Andrew Johnson or some of the other people I would consider demagogues as presidents, is that Lincoln believed in certain principles and adhered to them. So not everything was up for a popular vote. You know, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, essentially, according to Lincoln, we weren't going to put up to a vote in the new territories. This regime, this American regime, was going to stand for something. The president had an obligation to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And he was going to do so as a commitment to those principles. So that is one thing that sets him apart from those who believe in a more popular or populist conception of the presidency. The other thing I would say, Lindsay, is Lincoln is the exact opposite of Andrew Jackson in terms of never personalizing disputes. Jackson always personalized disputes. If you attack the Jacksonian position, you are attacking Andrew Jackson. Lincoln's the exact opposite. He never personalizes his conflicts with Stephen Douglas, even with Jefferson Davis. I challenge anyone to go out there and find comments about Jefferson Davis made by Abraham Lincoln of a disparaging personal nature. They're not there. If Andrew Jackson had presided over the Civil War, trust me, they would have been there. So there is a more restrained view of how one conducts oneself as president. There's a commitment to certain principles that are not subject to an up or down vote. Now, I grant you, he took some steps that expanded the powers of the presidency, no question. But he always tried to link those actions, and maybe they were a stretch at times, to his Article II powers. And he always made it clear that when the emergency passed, the emergency measures would pass as well. I think at heart, Lincoln was a Whig president who was confronted with an incredible crisis, but would have preferred to conduct himself more as a Whig as opposed to a Jacksonian.
Excellent answer. So Tom has shared another question, which perhaps Tony can tackle for us. Tom asked, the third branch of government, the judiciary, was very much a work in progress during the early years of the Republic. Any thoughts on how Washington or Hamilton would think, what they would think about SCOTUS today and the general judicial branch more broadly, and how that has evolved?
Right. Hamilton did think about it quite a bit. Of course, in Federalist 78, ironically, he calls the judiciary the weakest branch, right? The least dangerous branch of government. And, you know, I think he did believe in the power of judicial review in that Federalist paper. And you know, I think he and Washington very much supported it, or would support, you know, they had died, but would support, you know, Marshall's vision, you know, of an energetic and yet constitutionally restrained national government. And so they would have been sympathetic to that. And of course, Hamilton helps lay down the groundwork for judicial review, not only in Federal 78, but also in his work on Rutgers v. Waddington and some of the other cases defending Tories and the loss of their property, the confiscation of their property in the 1780s. So what would they think about what it's become? I think it'd be pretty unrecognizable. I think that both of them would have thought that the sort of what some people call the imperial judiciary would, they would have seen that there's maybe too much deference on the part of the political branches, the executive and the legislative branches to the decisions of the court. I think they saw all three branches had their distinct powers, but also checks and balances. And maybe they would have thought that the court has assumed too many powers rather than just being an arbiter in cases, that they've taken on too much power over the course of the 20th century, last 150 years or so.
I would just add to that Hamilton does mention in the Federalist Papers the importance of judicial temperament, of picking judicial nominees who abided by precedent. And he says something to the effect, and I'm loosely paraphrasing here, that judges should not and would not substitute their own personal views for the law. And in that sense, I think, in response to the question, if Hamilton were to come back, he would probably be somewhat upset with the course of the modern judiciary.
So both of you talked a little bit about, or you at least alluded to, the importance of the relationship between Washington and Hamilton in the formation of the federal government and the executive branch in particular. How does that relationship, which at times was contentious, compare to some of the other sort of key relationships that we think of when we think of the founding era, whether it be Jefferson and Adams, Jefferson and Madison, Abigail and John Adams, the ones that we tend to think of as the big pairings?
Right. Well, I think what we argue in the book very strongly is that this really is the key and most important relationship of the founding. Just in terms of what it contributed to the victory in the Revolutionary War, to constitution making, and then finally to nation building in the 1790s. I mean, one cannot really imagine the course of this country if Jefferson had been the first president, right? And Madison and the other Jeffersonians had been, all his advisors. The nation would have looked very different, and I think much weaker, right? And sort of maybe its sustainability and survivability might even be in question. Other relationships bore great fruit and were important. Jefferson and Adams had their ups and downs throughout the course of the 1780s and 90s and after, right after their deaths. Jefferson and Madison was an important relationship, but during the course of their presidencies, they probably become more Hamiltonian and Washingtonian in their outlook. And I just don't think that they engage in the same kind of nation building that Hamilton and Washington do. They're in the opposition mostly during the formation of the country, and to the extent that their relationship later on bears fruit, it's really because they adopt sort of these Hamiltonian type of policies. So I think we both argue that it's really the most important relationship of the founding, sort of bar none.
I think one thing that sets the relationship between Washington and Hamilton apart from Adams and Jefferson, or Jefferson and Madison, or John and Abigail, is the fact that both Washington and Hamilton were veterans of the war. Both of them had been in situations, in Washington's case, going back to the French and Indian War, where they could have very easily been killed. Washington had so many horses shot out from under him in both of these conflicts. It's amazing he made it to the presidency. But my point I'm trying to make, and Hamilton could have easily been killed at Yorktown, where he was the first over the parapet at that battle, and in other situations as well. The point I'm trying to make is that combat is a bonding experience like no other. I've never been in combat, but I teach at a war college. I've talked to plenty of folks who've seen some serious combat, and they tell me it is a bonding experience unlike any other. And I think to a great extent, Washington and Hamilton going through that war, experiencing death up close and personal with people right around them, and developing this sense that so many lives, so much treasure had been put on the line for this cause. They both became committed to creating a sense of American identity. And that also, I think, sets them somewhat apart, at least from Jefferson and Madison. They truly were, for their time, nationalists, and they were committed to creating a sense of Americanism. Both Hamilton and Washington used the term thinking continentally. They wanted to convince their fellow citizens to think continentally. And I think that was a common experience shared by those who had served in the Continental Army. And the rest of the folks you mentioned did not share that experience.
Yeah, I think that's so important and so often overlooked when talking about sort of partisan ideologies in the 1790s is people like Henry Knox, who shared those experiences with them, had that same sort of almost militaristic nationalism that came only from having a unique experience that even if people served in political positions during the war, they couldn't quite grasp. Okay, one last question.
Just one more thing. You know, they understood what it nationhood would take, right? They knew that it couldn't just be a nation of sort of small yeoman farmers, right? That the continent was very diverse. It included a lot of different economic groups, a lot of different political groups, a lot of different social groups, religions, and so forth. So they had to think continentally, and in a world of empires, which were scattered throughout, you know, they were still contending in the 1790s for North America, that, you know, national weakness would have meant the destruction of the nation. So, you know, a lot of these men who had served understood what it took and the strength that it would need to build that nation.
Absolutely. So we are, regardless of sort of your political position, I think most people can agree that 2020 is a pretty tense moment and potentially a very interesting one for the future of the nation. So what are your guys' thoughts about the likelihood of a return to sort of the presidency that you've written about at the origins, or what you think of as sort of a healthier conception of the office?
I think we still probably have a ways to go in terms of return to what I would consider to be a healthier conception of the office. Both parties, I think, are still inclined to overpromise, to try to manipulate public opinion as best they can, and partly do that through dangling various rewards out to elements of their base. I hate to end on a somewhat pessimistic note, but again, I think we're still a little bit removed from getting back to a healthier, more balanced situation. I hope I'm wrong about that, by the way.
Right, and I'd like to answer the question, you know, talking a little bit maybe more about the American people right now, that, and we do this a lot at the Bill of Rights Institute. You know, we need to talk to each other more. We need to be a little more magnanimous towards each other. We need to maybe compromise a little bit. We need to listen. We need to restore that civic conversation and a healthier civic order in this country if we're going to achieve anything. We're really divided right now, unfortunately, and I think if we think about Lincoln's young men's Lyceum speech and just get back to just being a little bit more forgiving to each other and not thinking that everything is so political, right down to the kind of coffee you drink or the burritos you eat, and just restore some common ground as Americans. I think that's really critically important going forward during this election season and after 2020.
Just a quick note to build on what Tony said. He used the word magnanimity. One consistent theme throughout my book of terms of the presidents that I consider to be truly great is they bore or shared that characteristic of magnanimity. They had an ability to put themselves in their opponent's shoes. They tended to refrain from the politics of personal destruction. They were just great-souled men and women. And Tony makes a nice point. I think we all need to try to adopt a more magnanimous view towards those of us who disagree with us.
Well, so with that, that brings to an end to tonight's episode of History Author Talks. And as I said at the beginning, the purpose of this program is to bring together some authors closer to their audience. I think that we all learned a lot, and despite Stephen's pessimistic tone, I think it's actually an optimistic tone all around, because I think we all learned a lot. You all think that I do this for you. No, I learned a lot for me. That's why I like to do these shows, because I learned so much. I learned so much from our authors. I think our guest host, Lindsay, did a terrific job tonight in guiding us through tonight's show. I've just sent you the URL for Lindsay's website as well. And I hope that you all join us for our next episode of History Author Talks, September 22nd at 7 p.m. That's next Tuesday. We have Todd Braystead, author of The Grand Forage, The Battleground Around New York City, 1778. We have Larry Kidder, author of Revolutionary Princeton, 1774 to 1783, who are both also contributors to the 10 key campaigns of the American Revolution. So I remind you again that you can go to historyauthortalks.com for links to Stephen, Lindsay, and Tony's websites. Also for, you can share, as of tomorrow morning, I'll have tonight's episode posted on the past shows tab that you can share with your friends. And I want to thank you all for spending your Tuesday evening with us. And certainly my applause goes to Stephen, Tony, and Lindsay. Thank you all and good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Roger.